If you are a mainstream Christian and you're easily triggered, you're not going to like this video because I'm going to speak negatively about the person that most of you idolize the most, Paul. And make no mistake, I'm not speaking negatively of Paul because I reject him or don't believe his words are inspired scripture. Quite the opposite. I love Paul's words and I do believe his words are inspired scripture. And I believe that he has to be in the Bible because he's your Deuteronomy 13 test. But that's not what this video is about. The reason I'm speaking negatively of him is because the doctrine that you guys have subscribed to throws 98% of the Bible into the trash, and then the other 2%, which is Paul's words that you use to build your doctrine upon, you've taken out of context. And when I actually put Paul in context, where he makes sense with the rest of the scriptures, I'm labeled as a heretic by most mainstream Christians. And here's the thing about this video. I'm going to prove that you have taken his words out of context and you're only using his words to fit your doctrine that is out of sync with the rest of the Bible. So again, if that's not something you can emotionally handle, I suggest you stop watching this video right now. So let's go ahead and dive right on into that study now, shall we? First things first. Christians have a really bad habit of universally applying Paul's letters, except when it doesn't fit their doctrine. Most Christians seem to have joined the New Age movement of equality, where men and women are equal. They can do equal things, equal jobs. It's not like God created us for different purposes or anything. So if we truly want to apply Paul's letters universally like most Christians like to, then we should consider this. 1 Timothy 2, likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not braided with hair in gold or pearls or costly attire. Sorry, ladies, it looks like your Sunday attire needs to get chucked out the window. No more fancy jewelry or showy clothes, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. This completely goes against mainstream doctrine too. We don't need to do good works. What is this, Paul? Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. I wonder what reaction Rosie's going to have to say about that. Her and many others attempt to exert authority over a man, and they most certainly don't remain quiet. And what do? They try to teach. And before someone comes into my comment section in a giant uproar, I am completely, and I mean completely okay with a godly woman coming on here and sharing the Bible. Because I'm not universally applying those verses from Paul. Those verses were from Paul to a specific person dealing with specific issues with people he actually knew. That's why they're called epistles, because they are letters. And if we're being really honest with ourselves, we need to acknowledge the fact that these are letters. Paul most certainly didn't write these letters thinking that they were going to be scripture and be scrutinized for the next 2,000 years. I also guarantee you Paul never thought his words would be used as a reason not to obey God. But that's a discussion for another time. To prove my point here, if Paul believed his letters were going to be in the Holy Bible someday, do you think he would say stuff like this? Hey, by the way, when you come back, bring that cloak I left with Carpus along with those books and that parchment. This is in 2 Timothy 4. He's doing what you would do in a letter. Hey, on your way back, can you grab that stuff I left at What's-His-Face's house? If you thought your letter was going to be included in the Holy Bible one day, would you say something like this in it? Because I know I wouldn't. Every Christian seems to think that every single word out of Paul's mouth was straight from God. But even Paul says it's not. For example, 1 Corinthians 7, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord. He's giving instructions here that are not found in the Torah and did not come from God. That's exactly why he's specifying this to them. And what about stuff like this in 1 Corinthians 11? But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. Well, sorry, ladies, but if we're going to universally apply Paul's letters, you need to cover your head or you're dishonoring yourself and bringing shame to your family. And again, I'm okay if a woman doesn't want to cover her hair. And I'm okay if a woman comes on TikTok and shares the gospel. because I understand the context of these letters and who he was writing to and what it was about. And this brings me to my next point. How would you read a letter? Would you pull a little bit out of the middle of the letter and just say, oh, yep, that's what the letter was about? No, you read a letter front to back all the way through. And it doesn't take most people like 6 months to read a letter like it does at your church. If you spend 6 months studying one letter, but you can't even sit down for an hour to read it from the front to the back without stopping, you're not going to get the context of the letter. Paul spoke Aramaic and Greek. Those are very idiomatic languages. So yes, Paul may have said stuff like, you're not under the law, you're under grace, but is that what Paul actually meant? Spoiler alert, it's not what you think it means. Idiomatic languages are very poetic. One word has 20 different meanings or more. It's very dependent on the context and the culture. Let me give you an example of this. If I say it's raining cats and dogs at my house right now, you understand that it's not literally raining cats and dogs at my house. It's just a heavy flow of rain. Well, the entire Bible is stuff like that. If you don't understand the cultural reference, then you're not going to get what the words mean. A sentence can't always be taken literally. You have to understand if it's an idiomatic phrase or paragraph or letter. When Paul said you're not under the law, you're under grace, it would kind of be like me saying you're not under the weather, you're fine. Because you know in our culture that idiom, under the weather, means you're experiencing the ill effects of the weather, you're sick. But if you're not under the weather, you're not experiencing the negative effects of the weather. Same concept. You're not experiencing the ill effects of the law because by your grace you were grafted into Israel and now you're walking a life that's pleasing to the Most High. Not under the law does not mean you can break God's commandments. In no world does that mean you can break God's commandments. If it did, then what I said in the beginning of this video is true. You might as well throw 98% of the Bible in the garbage and call God a liar to his face. Because when God said these laws are for my people forever, you're either saying you're not his people or you're saying God's a liar. Those are literally the only two options, and most of you people don't realize this because you're not actually studying the whole Bible in context. You're only studying Paul's letters one tiny chunk at a time, taking it out of its cultural context. And you don't have to take my word for it. Read the entire Bible for yourself and ask questions along the way. Hey, when God said we needed to do this forever, did it really mean forever? Spoiler alert, yes it did. And if somebody's made it this far with me and still disagrees with me, they're definitely going to say something like, oh, those laws were only for Israel. Again, completely disregarding the fact that all of Romans 9 through 11 is explaining how the Gentiles are grafted into Israel. Because there's absolutely no covenant made with the Gentiles. The only covenants made in the Bible, Hebrews 8, is with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, the Jews. And all over the Torah, you're going to find stuff like this. No. There's not one law for the Jews and one law for other people. There's one law for everyone who wants to serve me. My laws are for you and the stranger who sojourns with you. You shall be alike before the Lord. I know, shocking, right? That our God doesn't have double standards. And then stuff like this in Malachi 3. For I, Yahuwah, do not change. And if God doesn't change, you have a big problem with your doctrine. Because there's an awful lot of laws God said was forever. Seriously, like a staggering amount. Over and over and over again, you'll see this in the Torah. These laws and statutes are forever. Laws and statutes forever. Forever. I hope you're starting to see my point. You can't pick and choose what you like out of Paul's letters. Because Paul may have said stuff like, you're not under the law, which you take as meaning you don't have to follow God's laws anymore. But then that also means you have to reconcile a lot of his other words. Because in Romans 2, he said it's not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. And in Romans 3, do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. And Paul may have said stuff like, for sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under the law, but under grace. But what did he mean? Because in the very next verse, he says this. What then? Are we to sin because we are not under the law, but under grace? By no means. And the only definition we get for sin in the New Testament is 1 John 3:4, breaking God's commandments. So you can read what Paul said in his letters, but you're not going to understand what Paul meant in his letters unless you study things in context.